Paris, 1910. The Seine rises fast enough to turn boulevards into canals. Boats drift past shop signs. Basements fill. Entire blocks evacuate. Newspapers describe it as a brutal test of modern infrastructure. Water versus the city of light. But the most important discovery of 1910 didn't happen on the flooded streets. It happened after the water began to leave. Because when Paris started pumping the metro dry, when engineers went down to inspect foundations and decide whether the underground could still carry the weight of a modern capital, workers cleared sediment that had been sealed for a long time. And beneath the expected layers, below metro debris, below medieval drains, below what people call Roman remnants, they found rooms that did not behave like normal history. Not collapsed tunnels, not broken pipes, walls, chambers, stonework sitting deeper than municipal plans said anything existed. And here's the part that should make you pause. Internal notes from that year repeat the same quiet phrase, like a warning nobody wanted to say out loud. Unforeseen structures, unexpected depth, older than anticipated. If this is nothing, explain three things at once. Why were the deeper rooms aligned on a clean geometric grid, like they belonged to a planned system, not random caves? Why did the stone blocks look too precise for the accepted timeline? Tight joints, clean angles, almost no visible mortar? And why, right when those details appeared in photographs, did the public reports suddenly become vague, and then the deepest access points were sealed again? That combination, geometry, precision, and silence, is the signature of a buried story. This started as routine drainage. The orders were practical. Empty the flooded metro, check foundations in the worst districts, and document any damage before the city rebuilt. But the moment crews broke through the thickest flood sediment, they hit a different kind of layer, one that felt less like old Paris and more like something Paris was built on top of. The first anomaly was alignment. In a normal city, layers don't line up perfectly. A medieval sewer ignores a Roman wall. A modern tunnel cuts across whatever came before. Different builders, different centuries, different needs. But beneath Paris in 1910, multiple layers followed the same orientation. Corridors above matched corridors below. Vaults from one layer sat directly over vaults that looked older, yet shared the same angles. Load-bearing walls kept the same trajectory even when separated by meters of fill and unknown decades. It was as if every era that built here was tracing an older blueprint, one that wasn't recorded in any public archive. At first, engineers tried to label what they saw in the simplest way possible. Abandoned quarries, medieval cellars, natural limestone caverns. Paris is famous for voids. It's easy to reassure yourself. But as the pumps pushed deeper, the void explanation began to fail. Some chambers were too symmetrical, too level, too deliberate. The arches held their curve with a kind of mathematical confidence that doesn't fit improvised underground work. The walls didn't feel like patched masonry. They felt engineered. Consistent thickness, repeating ratios, coherent planning. Recovery photos from 1910, grainy, dim, developed in offices that smelled like wet paper, show men standing beside blocks so large the workers look reduced, like they're posing next to industrial equipment rather than ordinary stone. And the joints are what make those images unsettling. No sloppy seams, no thick mortar, no uneven courses, just fitted stone. A puzzle assembled so tightly you struggle to see where one block ends and the next begins, even under harsh shadow. Then came the watermarks. At depths that should have been isolated from long-term flow, crews found surfaces smoothed like river rock. floors with a sheen that doesn't form in a season, erosion channels carved into edges as if water had moved through those corridors for years. But this was below the known behavior of the Seine, below flood levels, below where flowing water should be shaping anything at all. Either the geology was wrong, or the history of water under Paris is older and deeper than anyone wanted to document. This is where the tone changes in the paperwork. Early logs read like confident engineering: pump, measure, reinforce, move on. Later logs become cautious, shorter, less descriptive, a strange reluctance to name what's being seen. And it wasn't just the writing. The photographs changed too. Early shots show wide angles, full rooms, scale, context. Later shots tighten, crop, lose the far walls, lose the ceiling, lose the connecting corridors. If you've ever watched an archive forget something, you know the technique. You don't destroy everything. You break the puzzle into pieces so no one can assemble it. In scattered fragments of correspondence, one feature appears again and again: grand circular platforms. Later explanations tried to soften it: wells, cistern bases, medieval water collection. But nothing about these platforms feels like simple plumbing. They were too perfectly level, too massive, too centered. Some had radial patterns carved into the surface, lines that looked less like casual chisel marks and more like layout guides, the kind you make when something is meant to be mounted precisely. Several workers described them privately as ceremonial foundations, not utility. Monumental bases built for something important and heavy. And then there were the columns, not the tourist columns above ground, the famous ones you already know. I'm talking about underground support columns and load points engineered for weights far beyond what the buildings above them should require. Overbuilt, overcalculated, like they were designed for a different surface, something larger, or simply something the official story doesn't acknowledge ever stood there. That one detail opens an uncomfortable possibility. Modern Paris may not rest on natural limestone alone. It may sit on a lower framework, an older city-scale support system, repurposed and partially buried. And the deeper teams drained, the more the corridors stopped looking accidental. They weren't random tunnels. They resembled infrastructure, measured, planned, extending beyond the footprint of any single building. Passages that continued into darkness past the drainage zone, as if the exposed section was only a small slice of a much bigger network. A lower city, not a myth city, a functional underlayer. And then comes the detail everyone tries to dissolve into harmless geology: metal embedded in stone. Not a dropped tool, not debris washed into a crack. Pieces that looked fused into the limestone, melted, crystallized, or introduced under temperatures that don't belong to ordinary underground work. The safe explanation arrived later: mineral staining, iron deposits, natural chemistry. But surviving notes hint at placement, patterns rather than randomness, repeating inclusions that resemble function, not nature. Even if you stay skeptical, that detail matters because it shows how the official story operates. It doesn't argue with the anomaly, it relabels it. Natural, unimportant, nothing to see. And right when the contradictions piled up, the recovery project changed direction. The sites didn't finish, they closed. Sections that had been drained were filled back in. Corridors were blocked with modern concrete. Entrances that had just been reopened were sealed, as if someone wanted the darkness back immediately. You'll hear the justification: safety, flood prevention, stability. And sure, some of that can be true. But here's the problem: the spaces that were sealed first weren't the crumbly medieval layers. They were the cleanest ones, The most intact, most engineered, most historically dangerous rooms, the perfect platforms, the precise joints, the corridors that hinted at a larger grid, those were the ones that vanished from access first. And the reports that survive do something else that's easy to miss. They simplify. A room with clear planning becomes earlier foundation. A corridor that continues beyond the zone becomes geological void. A platform that doesn't fit a cistern becomes collection system. The language gets smaller as the discovery gets bigger. That's not how proud engineers write when they find something extraordinary. That's how people write when they are being instructed to stop feeding the record. If you study the final weeks of the 1910 recovery, the pattern is hard to ignore. Exposure, brief documentation, minimization, resealing. And that's where the old world angle becomes unavoidable for this niche. Because Tartaria, however you define it, isn't just a map label. It's a shorthand for a claim that an older infrastructure existed, that it was rebranded in the 19th century, and that the modern world inherited structures it didn't fully build or fully understand. If that claim is even partially true, then the one thing you must do is control the layers. You don't need to demolish a buried city. You just need to keep it buried and make sure the paperwork never gives it a name. The flood of 1910 threatened that. It forced people underground. It forced excavation. It forced cameras into places no one was looking. For a short window, the water pulled back enough to reveal that Paris might not be a first build. It might be a top layer. And if Paris is a top layer, then Paris is not unique. How many other cities have lower cities? How many disasters, floods, fires, wars, exposed too much, too fast, and then were followed by repairs that quietly resealed the wrong parts? Once you start thinking in layers, you notice how often history is written as a clean timeline, while the ground tells a messier story. The timeline says Romans, then medieval, then modern. The ground says alignment, repetition, inheritance. It's the same geometry, repeated, and repetition is the enemy of coincidence. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If the deepest evidence under Paris looked like the earliest architecture, if the most engineered layers were the ones buried first, what were they protecting? Not the public, the narrative. Because if the foundations beneath Paris truly show construction methods that don't fit the accepted story, then the real mystery isn't what the flood did in 1910. It's what else lies beneath the cities of the world. And how many times we've been taught to call it nothing. Paris is called the City of Light. But the 1910 flood suggests the city has another identity too, a city of layers. And some layers were never meant to be seen. This video presents an alternative narrative for discussion and storytelling, not a verified historical record.